Hello and welcome to another episode of the ICC Academy Livecast, a new podcast series where we take a deeper dive into global business trends and ideas. I'm your host, Thomas Paris, and in this episode, we will explore trends in the financial industry relating to anti-money laundering, counterterrorism, and corruption. Our special guest today is Aaron Lee, partner at Allen Gledhill. Thank you so much for joining us, Aaron. How are you doing?
All good, and thank you, Thomas, for having me here.
So before we get started into the topics we have lined up, could you tell us a little bit about your background, your passion for the topic as a whole, and what it is that you do at Allen Gledhill?
Sure. Thanks, Thomas. So I was a former prosecutor in Singapore's Attorney General's chambers for about 6 years. I was doing quite a lot of white-collar crime and prosecuting all sorts of serious offences involving white-collar crime, corruption, and even petty crimes. And that's where obviously it piqued my interest in criminal matters. And I joined private practice sometime in 2006. I started at Allen Gledhill. I'm still at Allen Gledhill, where I'm currently a partner. I head up the firm's white collar and investigations practice group, and that's within the litigation and dispute resolution team. In essence, I'm a litigator, and I deal with a lot of defense work. I also advise quite a number of blue chip companies, financial institutions concerning quite a number of white-collar regulatory issues. And I think, as you know, Thomas, Allen Gledhill is the biggest Singapore law firm here, a full-service law firm in Singapore. And we do a whole host of legal services, and in particular, my practice group, which is unfortunately for quite a number of industry participants, become quite focused in terms of scrutiny in this day and age.
Right. Whether you're a medium-sized hedge fund, an investment bank, a European Union bank, any bank around the world, or even just a large corporate, the impact of bribery and corruption on poverty, inequality, and social justice is having an impact on the reputation and profitability of these companies. What would you say are the biggest trends in the industry when it comes specifically to financial corruption today?
Right. So in the last 5 to 10 years, in my experience dealing with quite a number of these things, corruption is rearing its ugly head by becoming bigger in terms of dollar value, bigger in terms of the transaction, becoming more complex as well, and it's also becoming cross-border. The clearest example that has happened in recent times would be the Petrobras corruption scandal that's erupted in Brazil and has had ramifications across a whole host of jurisdictions, including the United States and, of course, Singapore. Apart from it being bigger and cross-border, I've also noticed that corruption in this day and age, for the bigger ones at least, involves a fair number of senior people. And when I mean senior people, these are people up the food chain, directors, senior managers, who have actually a fairly important role as a gatekeeper. And these people obviously have some level of influence in transactions and in terms of approval processes.
What, in your own words, what is trade-based money laundering?
Right. Trade-based money laundering, if I could just break it up a bit,
Yes.
Money laundering obviously would be the laundering or washing of the genesis of certain proceeds of crime, and then subsequently you wash it and then you subsequently integrate it back into society as if it's kosher and clean. Trade-based money laundering as a process would be utilizing trade, whether it's trade financing or in real trade of trading of commodities rather, in terms of money laundering. So it uses the financial systems, it uses existing practices within countries and intra-countries in order to perpetrate money laundering. Now let's take a few steps back and let's talk about first what are the typical industries which are very prevalent in terms of corruption and bribery.
Yes.
And let's talk about what steps have been taken in recent years by institutions and governments to combat this. Now, typically, the biggest problem risk areas are obviously in the marine and construction industry. These industries are very rife, and typically, every other year you would see one big bust or investigation concerning these areas, especially in Asia, which, as you know, it's developing and there's a lot of marine and construction activities going on. Another very specific risk area would be government projects. Now, what is interesting about Singapore is, notwithstanding our very good ranking in the Transparency Index for corruption, we are surrounded by very, very high-risk jurisdictions. And what is even more interesting is that, as you have probably read and know, as Singapore tries to model itself as a Switzerland of the East, quite a lot of MNCs are basing themselves and having headquarters in Singapore with regional businesses and regional outfits all across. And because we are surrounded and we have a sea of very high-risk jurisdictions around us, what is then interesting is that although the level of corruption in Singapore is still considered fairly low, but the level of corruption in our neighboring countries and the flow of funds between Singapore and these neighboring countries, be it for marine activities, governmental projects, or construction works, are fairly high. And that obviously heightens the risk of corruption. Now, bringing that back to your question about what effective methods are there to curb these activities, as you know, the most common way in which money laundering is carried out would be through the finance system, through the banks, in effect. Of course, we can talk about other methods of money laundering, and that will take a whole day, involving jewelry, watches, and art pieces. But that's another topic for another time. Now, the banking financial institution and process historically has been and will still continue to be the nub and focus of criminals and syndicates in order to facilitate their AML activities. Now, your question is, how has today's changes, processes been effective? Now, I will illustrate and answer this by way of something that has happened in the past few years, which has caught everyone's attention and everybody knows about this. And this is the 1MDB scandal.
Yes.
Now, the 1MDB scandal, just like the Petrobras scandal, also traverses quite a number of jurisdictions. Obviously, it emanated and originated from Malaysia. Funds came to Singapore. Quite a number of activities and issues were also carried out in the United States and Switzerland. Now, insofar as AML and CFT is concerned, in the past few years, due to a lot of pressure and a lot of motivation and guidance by the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, obviously the AML CFT regime and processes in Singapore around the region have improved tremendously, especially in our financial institutions. However, what we have come to observe through this 1MDB scandal would be that, notwithstanding that a lot of these banks and financial institutions have anti-AML and CFT processes in place and quite a number of policies, they were just not properly monitored or implemented.
Right.
In other words, these were processes which were in existence but not effective enough. It was just, unfortunately, for quite a number of banks, a box-ticking exercise, and nobody paid particular attention to close out issues. So you would have seen in Singapore and heard in the news that 2 banks were actually closed down. They lost their licenses arising from this. And what do we learn? Those banks had those AML, CFT processes, they had their policies in place. However, they had senior members of management who were colluding with individuals so as to bypass or circumvent these processes and policies. And that obviously weakens the whole infrastructure and integrity of the process. That's one clear example. Another example, and this is public news, several international banks and local banks in Singapore have also been sanctioned and fined significantly. Certainly not in the amounts that we see in the United States, but still significant in Singapore. And why were they sanctioned or fined? The MES had found that quite a number of these banks, although again they had these processes and checklists and policies in place, they were not effective in the sense that it was not being enforced. right? So, for example, in several of the situations that I've encountered without naming the banks, we have seen alerts raised as red flags, but these alerts as AML or CFT red flags were not properly investigated into or not properly closed out or resolved per the existing policy already in place. So when you say that, is there an effective method in place? I would say actually most of our financial institutions, especially the international banks and players, they do have a very good base. They have a very good structure already in place. But it's about, the devil's always in the details, as we all know. And unfortunately, as long as there's a weak link in the chain, these weak links can unfortunately fester to become big problems. And I believe that that was the genesis and the whole problem in this whole 1MDB saga, where banks were caught out by fraudsters, banks were caught out by criminals because of the weaknesses in their system. So, are there effective checks and balances? There are quite effective checks and balances, but in my experience and from what I've seen in the past few years, they can always be improved. Right? They can always be improved, they can always be revised, they can always be strengthened, especially with the dynamic landscape of AML activities. The very nature of criminal syndicates means that they exploit every single weak chain, every single loophole that they see. They will want to make use of that.
If we take a look at the 1MDB scandal specifically, what have we learned from this? Or all the examples that you listed yourself, is there something that has been taken on board from the operational challenges to make sure that, to find remedies for the future? Or is this all, obviously this is always going to be happening. This is going to be a systematic problem with having, hundreds or even thousands of people within the process. But have we learned from every time we have one of these crises to be able to sort of change the way that business is being run?
I think that we do, but due to the evolving and very radical nature of crime, unfortunately, AML issues will always stay with us. They will always be with us now and in the future. The question is always nature and extent. I feel that most of the financial institutions here have learned a big lesson. Quite apart from the big fines, quite apart from the fact that 2 banks have actually lost their licenses, you would see a lot of things happening in the United States and Switzerland as well. And people now know what has been exploited. People now know the no-nos and the do-nots and the whatnots that unfortunately will lead to exploitation by criminal syndicates and criminals alike. So going back to the processes, there are processes in place always, but as we know in banks, typically there are 3 lines of defense. And the 3 lines are, number 1, the front line, business office. They're the first usually to detect. They're the first to monitor. They're the first to know what is happening. We have the second line, which is compliance. Obviously, they're independent of business and they have a role to play in protecting the integrity of the system. The third line would be the external and last line, which would be either internal auditors or external auditors. So I still feel that these 3 lines of defense would still apply to AML and CFT issues, but it needs to be robust. It needs to be tested. It needs to be looked into. It needs to be strengthened from time to time. It needs to be reviewed. It can't just simply be a policy as a vase for beauty cosmetic purposes, which we saw in the 1MDB case, a lot of banks were using them for. For example, as I mentioned earlier, alerts were raised, but policies were not actually enforced in squeezing out these problems and highlighting them to compliance for proper resolution and even reports to the authorities. So, in a nutshell, yes, lessons have been learned, but because at the pace in which criminals are inventing other ways to perpetrate AML, CFT activities, it's just increasingly more and more difficult. Like you see, for every scam that we see in Singapore, there's a love scam, there's a DHL scam, there are all sorts of scams, and all of a sudden they morph into something else the next month. So when the police and regulators and the industry participants are ready for the love scams and the DHL scams, our dear friends have already moved on to something else. And we need to anticipate that. We need to be smart enough, which brings me on to my next issue, which I wanted to highlight, which is technology. Now, as we have read, technology has been a great enabler for the financial institution. We have apps which we can just transfer money at the top of our fingertips, and it's made life quite easy for us in our daily transactions. But on the other hand, technology has been an enabler for crime as well. It's so easy to move money across. In the blink of an eye, monies are shifted between 5 different jurisdictions. So technology, in my view, is a great area in which we can actually help to combat AML, CFT, and even corruption. And what I've seen in banks, and especially the banks who are much more proactive and dynamic, they have actually devised algorithms. They have come up with programs on their own in order to detect red flags, in order to assess what risk areas they are into. For example, to certain particular banks, especially correspondence banks, flow-through transactions are one of the greatest risks. In other words, money comes into bank account A and money flows out the very next day. It's just an attempt to pass the monies through a certain bank or a certain jurisdiction to give the credibility of that jurisdiction, of that bank. And it goes to another bank, and another bank, another bank. So flow-through transactions are extremely common. And what I've seen in certain banks is that they have put in a certain set of parameters and an algorithm in order to catch out these flow-through transactions so that they can detect them as easily and as quickly as possible, and to either freeze those transactions if all the monies are not out of the system yet, or at least to make that report. Right. So a lot of banks have been fairly successful in coming up with these internal technological enablers to help them to detect and to combat and mitigate fraud, corruption, AML, and CFT issues.
And so we'll get to the technology part in just a sec, but just to circle back to what you were mentioning before about the internal processes and overcoming the challenges within each structure. Do you have, based on your experience, a sort of sterling example of an organization who has been able to either set the right process and being able to make sure that they are enacted properly, or has proven to be quite adaptable in a certain way? Maybe I'm just curious as to if for you there is one that you like to point to as saying, okay, well, these people are doing it more or less correctly.
Right. Unfortunately, again, I use the word unfortunately very often because it really is the case.
Right.
The scorecards of most of the big boys and international banks have not been particularly good. And you just need to look at the DOJ investigations and prosecutions and settlements to see that. Almost every major bank has been involved in these matters. But what is interesting would be that different banks have different weaknesses and different banks have different strengths. For example, a lot of our local banks are very risk averse. They will not go into certain transactions which other international banks traditionally would go into. They're extremely conservative, and that obviously helps them quite a bit. And for want of a better word, they were not involved in the 1MDB fallout or scandal. I wouldn't say that there is one particular organization or one particular company that I can hold out to be the poster boy. Instead, what I would typically do would be to go to the various examples being prosecuted in the US or the UK and around the region, and I will learn from those.
So worst case scenarios.
Exactly. So rather than to go to the poster boy of an organization and say, I'm going to be like that, I would typically go to the guys who have fallen short, and I would say, let's learn from those mistakes. And I would then look and try to crystal ball into the future to see what are the broad trends that are coming about. For example, you're absolutely right to say that trade-based activities are the next process for money laundering, which is utilized by criminals and syndicates all across. So look at the trends. Look at where the criminals are going. What are they doing? And then you have to adapt. You have to change. You may have to compromise some of your own activities. And then you really have to put up a united front in order to deal with the matter.
Right.
So one of the greatest ways in which you can help yourself in this is actually to go to the FATF website, the Financial Action Task Force website. It's unbelievably useful. It's got all sorts of policies, guidelines, processes, latest information on the trends. And for people who are thinking of ways to reinvent themselves, there are just so much literature out there and great websites in which you can read and learn in order to see where your organization can address and perhaps reduce the gaps and improve themselves.
Right.
Right.
So, on the subject of looking ahead, how are fintechs fitting into this space?
Right. Fintech is a very new area, especially in Singapore.
Right.
What is interesting about fintech as well as blockchain is that nobody thought about this 10 years ago, right? But because it is here and now, it is absolutely going to be exploited for criminal purposes. Absolutely. It's just a matter of time.
Right.
Right? The way I view fintech, blockchain, is the same way I view a lot of other processes like trade-based activities as well. They are all ways in which to enable commerce and business, but they are also ways in which criminals and syndicates can enable themselves in order to profit or to facilitate money laundering. They are all processes in which there are weaknesses, in which they can be exploited. Having said that, regulation for blockchain and regulation for fintech-related processes are really, really at its nascent stage. I don't think we have seen the worst of it yet. Perhaps that's why it's still not so heavily regulated. It's starting, especially for blockchain, but we have not seen, I think, the worst of it yet.
Right.
Right.
Is it because it's so fragmented? There are so many small ones cropping up all over the world that it makes it difficult to identify?
Yes and no. Yes, you're absolutely correct in that as well. But no, in the sense that at this point in time, we have not seen the CD-ROM equivalent, the VHS equivalent of processes which have been consolidated to become the one true fintech process, which is preferred by everybody across the world. Right? We're still seeing a lot of disparate chains, disparate pockets of processes and activities. So you're absolutely right in that. Unless and until we have the CD-ROM equivalent, the Blu-ray gold standard that most people subscribe to, we're going to still see a lot of disparate issues arising from these processes, and it may not be exploited to the extent that we have seen in the other areas concerning financing, like we see in the banking circle for letters of credits, etc., etc. Yeah.
So early on, you mentioned the different advancements in technology and how there is the capacity for this sort of tech, whether it's software or hardware, to either help or hinder the progress that you guys are making on the AML side. What are some examples of tech that has been proven very useful in this field, whether it is to combat AML or to identify red flags?
I think one of the ways in which certain banks have come out to combat AML and to raise red flags would be analytics. So they would actually study cases in which there are true incidents of AML or CFT or fraud or corruption, and they would learn how to model certain parameters to imitate such cases, and they will use analytics to therefore try to predict what typical transactions would fall into those separate buckets and therefore catch them early, right? So it is a combination of artificial intelligence and the combination of learning from your experience in terms of what has happened. In Singapore, it's still again at its fairly early stage. Quite a number of banks have started on this AI journey, and they have explored how AI can assist them. In fact, the government has actually spearheaded this in Singapore. In the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the central bank equivalent, they have actually come up with an algorithm, a program in which to sort out surveillance in order to determine market misconduct. So they've done exactly what I've mentioned, and this has been publicized by them, that they learned from the previous cases, the previous experience, what identifiable markers, parameters may suggest wrongdoing in terms of, for example, insider trading or bucketing in order to push up prices. And they would put these parameters, put them into an algorithm, run through the algorithm concerning all sorts of transactions out there and see what it throws up. And quite interestingly enough, and I hear from some of my friends there, that the hits have been fairly close. And it's still obviously an evolving, changing process being refined. But I would say something like that. It's a great initiative to be put into place in quite a number of financial institutions and banks because it really, really helps them. Artificial intelligence is no doubt the next way forward. You predict the future, you look back and review. So it's a real win-win situation if you can harness that power and use it to your advantage.
Yeah, the challenge is going to be what happens on the reverse.
Absolutely, and costs, because it's not going to be cheap as well.
Yes, well, yeah, which means that, I mean, I'm not sure exactly how this will net out, but I would assume that a lot of the AI is going to be top down when it comes to the bigger players,
Right.
and the way that they sort of integrate that into their processes.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And in the past, it's always been built or buy. And increasingly, a lot of my clients are finding that you can buy a platform, but you need to eventually build it into your own. Because you can't just buy a ready-made product out there and expect it to work perfectly in sync with what you have in your organization and your systems in place already.
Right.
So what I have heard, and some of my clients have been discussing them, that they're buying certain platforms, certain programs, and they're modifying this into their own so as to achieve their objectives in terms of algorithms and programs to combat CFT, fraud, etc., etc.
What would you say, except for, I mean, if we leave artificial intelligence on the side, which I think would be the obvious answer, but what would you say are the biggest disruptors in the field for the next few years to come? Let's say 5 years or even 10 years. Is there something that you see on the horizon that could be either a major problem or a boon for you guys in terms of support?
That's a good question. Major disruptors. I think one of them would obviously be government regulation. It's going to be a game changer. So let me elaborate on that. You may have heard that Singapore adopted a deferred prosecution agreement legislation recently, last year. This is akin to what you see the DOJ having in the United States, the SFO having in the United Kingdom, to allow market participants to enter into arrangements with the government in order not to be prosecuted, right? Or either it's a no prosecution agreement or a deferred prosecution agreement. Now, I think that's a game changer. It has not been applied in Singapore yet, but you have seen how it shapes the behavior and activities of market participants overseas. You would have seen in the US, some companies will find billions. That's a big, big hit on your P&L. And if there's such a big stick waiting in hand, I think market participants will be very, very wary and cautious in terms of what they want to do, especially in corruption, and what they want to, how they want to model their business and how they want to expand their business. We have seen firsthand quite a number of companies which have been fined arising from these arrangements, typically overseas. Number one, it's a huge hit on the P&L. It's also likely a huge hit on their counter price if they're listed companies. Reputation will be drawn out in the mud for obvious reasons. And you have to pay millions and millions of dollars in professional fees to lawyers, to accountants, across various different jurisdictions. So given the huge penalties and downsides involved in potentially these investigations and prosecutions and civil penalties, I think it's a big game changer. I think it serves a very big warning sign to participants, to businesses in Singapore. And the reason for that in particular, I use the example of Singapore, is that in the past, for corruption cases, 99.9% of the time, only individuals will be prosecuted, not the companies. And there's a policy behind that. Because when the company or organization is prosecuted, then it's a question of dollars and cents. Nobody goes to jail. Where's the deterrence then? But with the DPA arrangements in place, potentially you could get audit rights, remediation orders given to companies to make sure that they're in tip-top shape for their checks and balances to be put into place. We do not see this likely to happen, but in the States, you would have seen monitors being put into place, and that's pretty harsh. So I think that that's going to be a game changer in Singapore in time to come. You would have seen quite a lot of other jurisdictions was seeking to implement this sort of a DPA regime as well. Canada has just done so, and I believe that quite a number of other Asian countries are going to be doing so.
Right.
So you would see not just individuals being punished, but corporates, companies being put to the sword and having all sorts of terms and conditions attached to them. Now, I think that's going to be a game changer.
Right. No, I think that's an interesting perspective because from an outside looking in, you can get the impression that a lot of these mega corporations don't actually feel the impact of these fines and that it would just be a cost of doing business.
Right.
But it's interesting to note that, this not only does have a monetary impact, but it brings in all the processes back to the drawing board when it comes to reputation and everything else. So that's interesting.
Absolutely. The second disruptor, and I would phrase this very generally as a disruptor, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be technology.
Right. And
as you know, we don't know what technology holds. And as long as a new product comes out that can be made use by perpetrators of fraud, corruption, etc., you can bet your bottom dollar that technology is going to be exploited. Now, in connection with that, I think one of the greatest problems we're going to face in the coming age will be concerning cybersecurity. Your hacking, your internal releases by people who are employees within your own organizations. You will see this in WikiLeaks all the time. I think that's going to be one of the biggest threats to come because cybersecurity, if exploited properly, can lead to access by external parties into what is confidential, into what is secret for companies, banks, and financial institutions. So in recent times, what I've seen in the field of fraud, where cybersecurity has come to the fore, would be internal employees colluding with external parties. They know when payments are going to be made to vendors outside, to external vendors. So they will work together with external fraud parties to channel monies outside, or rather, to channel monies to parties other than the proper vendors. Mm-hmm. And how is this carried out? Number one, they know at the time of the year or the month when huge monies are going to be paid out to the external vendors. What do? They will have an email from a party who seems or appears to be that external vendor saying, for this particular month, I'd like you to pay to this account instead for X, Y, and Z reasons. They'll think about any reason to do so. And the person receiving it, thinking that that's the appropriate instructions from the external vendors, will either carry it out, or the person who was in collusion with the external parties will somehow participate to make sure that this flows through and goes out. So that's extremely common in this day and age. It's because emails have been hacked into, or cybersecurity is lax and they know exactly what are the ins and outs of the transactions and who is being paid every other month, and that gets exploited. Right. So cybersecurity to me and cybercrime is going to be the next big thing concerning technology, and that's going to be a game changer in due course.
Right. It's interesting because the two major disruptors that you mentioned, aside from AI, which we covered earlier, one of them is regulation and the other is technology. And one is writing with a pen and the other is writing with a keyboard. And I'm not sure whether they'll be able to keep up with each other at the same rate.
Absolutely. In the past 20 years, there's no way that regulation will keep up with crime. Right. Or misconduct. There's no way. It's always reactive, and I believe that that's going to be the way in the foreseeable future.
Mm. Well, I mean, this has been very interesting. Is there something specific that you would like to touch on before we close out?
I will like to touch on the issue concerning mitigation of risks. I think that's fairly important. How do we prevent fraud? How do we arrest and detect AML and CFT transactions? I think in my experience and in my line of work, number one, I see whistleblowing as a very, very important tool for intelligence gathering. Now, of course, in some organizations, the majority of whistleblowers are all rubbish complaints, very petty. But what is interesting in my experience and from what I've seen is that typically whistleblowers and complaints usually contain a ring of truth. It may not be 50%, it may not even be 30%, but there usually is some level of truth in there. And depending on what whistleblowers you have and how it's investigated, you can actually detect quite a bit of misconduct or crime arising from whistleblowers. And what is interesting in Asia, typically, people don't really speak up to hurl allegations and insults against each other. That's about 10 years ago. But in recent times, I've seen people actually much more ready, much more motivated to do so, whether through jealousy or otherwise. A lot of people are much more ready to stand up. And with the appropriate whistleblower processes and policies in place, for example, non-retaliation, for example, if you're allowed to do so on the basis of anonymity, etc., it can be a very, very powerful tool to channel and gather intelligence. The second thing I would like to touch upon is actually quite an interesting proposition. It's employee rotation. In my line of work, dealing with quite a bit of fraud and misconduct, quite a bit of naughty acts actually get found out when either employees leave or employees are sick or away for a period of time, somebody takes their place and they see something strange, right? The longer somebody has been in the system and in his or her job, obviously he or she would know all the dark secrets and loopholes and systems and will be able to exploit them. But when somebody new comes along, they tend to see things in a different light and they may have a different perspective. And that's another way in which perhaps you can help to detect and mitigate fraud, AML and all sorts of issues. Employee rotation, another subset of this will be secondments. So you can even second members of your internal audit team to a certain high-risk department or high-risk area to sit there for 2 to 3 weeks or a few months. You never know what this might throw. So in my recent experience, these two possible options have yielded quite a bit of success in terms of A, detecting fraud and misconduct, and 2, helping to arrest issues before they become really big.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Thomas. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. So for those listening, just a quick reminder that we are hosting live broadcasts every month. So sign up on our website for free and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And ladies and gentlemen, this has been another episode of the ICC Livecast. See you next time.